Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm Gerd Kasper. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin. In my prior public life, I was infamous for saying that architecture is the only art form that is inescapable. That is, you can avoid going into a museum, you can avoid going into a gallery, you can avoid going into a home, but you cannot avoid looking at architecture, splendid or horrible. And that is an obvious insight, I do not claim any particular originality for it. It's an obvious insight, though it's surprising how little it is known and how little it is felt. And I think tonight we will be finally totally disabused of the notion that architecture is escapable. Regina and I, this last weekend, were in Magdeburg. I don't know how many people in this room know Magdeburg, probably not many. I tried it out on Berliners today. Very small response, I have to say. And we had a fascinating time. Magdeburg was arguably destroyed about 3 times in its history. The first time in 1631, when the so-called imperial forces, die Kaiserlichen, destroyed it, and Gustav Adolf did not come to the rescue of Magdeburg, supposedly because the Magdeburg burghers were so superior to him and did not negotiate correctly with him. Then Magdeburg was destroyed again by the Royal Air Force in 1945, in January of 1945, just before the end of World War II. And then this is a more controversial and difficult statement, but then Magdeburg was destroyed again during the days of the GDR, when the socialist authorities in Magdeburg pulled down much of what had remained after the air raids of 1945. So here Regina and I came. It is now 25 years after unification, and we were truly impressed. I mean, Magdeburg has one building from the very old days, its cathedral, that survived the war unharmed, and that is a must for all of you. If you have never been to the Magdeburg Cathedral, drop all your other travel plans, go. I think I know all German cathedrals and many other cathedrals in Europe, and this is one of the most beautiful. To appreciate it, you need to get a guidebook. But apart from that, the city has now been rebuilt. First of all, they have tried to preserve whatever was left over after World War II and the socialist regime. But they have done it, and then they have added new buildings, some very interesting ones. Hundertwasser, his last work is in Magdeburg, very well worth going to. And so there is a lot of interesting stuff. But I'm, of course, not here as an employee of the public propaganda office for the city of Magdeburg, though Regina and I found lots of people in Magdeburg who thought the only place to live in Germany was Magdeburg. I would not go that far. But I would like to say that it drove home the point that will be part of our lecture tonight, that architecture and urban planning are cultural phenomena of the first order and therefore need to be taken very seriously. Now, Vladimir will be introduced by Professor Dolf Bonekamper. This is following my intense wish that every one of our fellows be introduced by a German from Berlin or anywhere. I'll take them from anywhere. But you at least were conveniently located here, right at the Technical University. And we are very grateful that all you had to do was take a small trip out here. She will introduce Vladimir. And Professor Dolf Bonekamp has a professorship in what in modern English would be, or American would be referred to as historical preservation. It is the only such professorship in Berlin, though not in the country, she told me. But the German word for what I have translated as historical preservation is Denkmalspflege. Now that suggests something rather different. And indeed, I was so, I deal a lot with both languages, and normally I can easily travel from one language to the other. But this kind of stunned me. So there is this wonderful dictionary on the web for German and English, and I used it and put the word Denkmalspfleger in it. And it translated as curator of monuments. Now, I don't think that is the way you think of yourself, right, as a curator of monuments. But that is what the term literally translated suggests. No, I think we will hear a much richer image of historical preservation. Professor, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm so glad to see Vladimir again. And I'm so somehow thrilled by the idea to see more of this fantastic Yugoslavian, ex-Yugoslavian modern architecture, because it came as a surprise to me. And first conferences, when we were talking about commemorative monuments already, I discovered that this supposedly socialistic country had so interesting and modernist monuments. I mean, now monuments to the dead of the partisan movements. And I had thought that in socialism there would be socialist realism and of course of a good class, maybe, but it was completely modernistic. And this, I was taken aback when I saw that first time some 20 years ago. But then, of course, to discover the architecture is much more. And it brings us to a context I would like to enlarge a little, because architecture obviously is inescapable, and let us say the context or the way architecture works is absolutely disconnectable from power and politics. And the way it is connected, of course, changes with time. And the expression political or ideological messages are encoded in change totally, because, I mean, you can have allegories like naked women or big animals like lions or whatever impersonates power and perhaps political messages. But this can all disappear, and there can still be a political message. But it would be differently encoded. And so this is what we are looking at, because modern architecture has been coded as progress, has been coded as liberty, has been coded as democratic, and has been coded as socialistic also. So what is it, after all? Is it all that, or is it nothing of it? Or depending upon circumstances, it can be this or that? And would that be a good solution to semanticizing or to an abstention of semanticizing architecture? No, because there is always the circumstances to look at, of course. And where is it? In what kind of space? In what kind of political and topographic space does this all happen? And in what time does it happen? And in what time do we look at it now? And this is what makes the ex-Yugoslavian modernist movements ultra important and interesting, because, of course, modernist architecture was progress. Modernist architecture was Western integration. modernist architecture was also Eastern integration, because look at these fantastic 60s buildings in Russia. This is modernism. So, and there is a connection between that and Yugoslavia also. So in a way, the Yugoslavian architecture of the 60s and 70s and even 80s somehow encodes both political, let us say, messages or blocks. And this makes the theme so interesting, because where is this Cold War, after all, in Yugoslavia, before we had the hot war in Yugoslavia? And I think, and now coming back to Vladimir, I'm sure that he is the person to talk about it. And I first met him to talk about these things on a conference in Belgrade when we were all taken for a visit of Novi Belgrade, which seems to be the ugly part of Belgrade. Oh no, you're completely wrong. It's really, really not only interesting, but beautiful. But I had to discover this, and I looked up in my photographs of Belgrade some years ago. I have this photograph of Vladimir pointing on the floor of a place where we are all standing and explaining about the system of distribution of spaces in Novi Belgrade and how much it was inspired by the plans for Brasilia and vice versa. So in a way, we were in a context that was completely Western, and in the same time completely socialist. So this makes the theme so thrilling for me. And of course, talking about architecture and politics is all very nice, but you've got to look at the architecture. You've got to understand how it is built. You've got to know where these people have gone to school, where did they learn to do their designs. And let us look at the designs and look at it not just as the encoding of messages, but as works of art. And so this is what you're going to show us. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for this generous introduction from both Professor Dolf Böhnekemper and Professor Kasper. You gave me a lot to work with now and really set the stage for what I'm going to talk about. But I hope I'm not going to disappoint you, because I am indeed not going to talk about monuments, even though even the lecture has been announced with an image of a monument. Instead, I will try to give a very big picture of my project here at the Academy, of the book that I'm writing while I'm here, which is about what I'm calling the socialist globalization of Yugoslavia during the Cold War, read through space and read through architecture and urban planning. I will show you a lot of images, probably a good 70-something slides. And I obviously will not be able to go very much into depth with any of them, but I will try to raise the important issue and try to present a big picture really of how architecture responds to and how it contributes to geopolitics. Right? Architecture is the most situated of the arts, right, or of the human activities, and its scale is relatively limited. And what I'm really interested in my talk tonight here is how architecture ties to all these different, much larger scales up to the scale of the globe, as well as how and why it moves around the world. So I will begin. When Berlin found itself divided by barbed wire on the morning of August 13, 1961, the Cold War assumed an architectural form. Within a short time, the Berlin Wall became much more than a pragmatic device to prevent East Germans from fleeing to the West. It became an architectural metonymy for the world divided by ideology and a stand-in for an entire period in global history. But less than 3 weeks after the inception of the wall, another urban project with far-reaching geopolitical connotations arose some 600 miles to the south. On September 1st, 1961, the leaders of the so-called Third World gathered in Belgrade for the first conference of the heads of state or government of non-aligned countries. The ceremonies during the meeting, including a walking sojourn into the empty plains of New Belgrade, Socialist Yugoslavia's new modernist capital, to plant trees of friendship in what would become known as Friendship Park. The seeds had assuredly been planted. Over the next 30 years, practically every foreign statesperson who visited Belgrade contributed a tree to this park, totaling more than 120 trees at the time of the country's collapse in 1991. The list of contributors reads like who's who of the Cold War. Third world leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, Fidel Castro, Sirmavo Bandaranaike, Gamal Abdel Nasser. 3 US presidents, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter. 2 secretaries general of the Soviet Communist Party, Leonid Brezhnev and Mikhail Gorbachev. 12 crowned heads, including Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, Queen Elizabeth II of Great Britain, King Carl Gustaf of Sweden, Emperor Hirohito, and others. There were also the leaders from both sides of the divided Germany, Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt, but also Erich Honecker. Unfortunately, I don't have the images. Most of these people have long since deceased, but in Friendship Park, they continue living through the trees they planted, side by side and on an equal footing. There is a strange inverse logic that binds Friendship Park and the Berlin Wall. Not only were they born just a few weeks apart, they also expired at almost the same time. As the wall began to crumble and Germany was reunited, Yugoslavia descended into a war, and the park was abandoned as a site of political ceremony. Even more importantly, the Berlin Wall and Friendship Park were symbolic antipodes on the map of the Cold War. They projected opposing visions of the global order: division versus encounter, confrontation versus collaboration. Their subsequent fortunes have been just as divergent. Friendship Park still exists, but is largely forgotten even in Belgrade, where the occasional strollers pass indifferently by the stone plaques bearing the names of some of the most powerful people of the 20th century. The Berlin Wall, however, reached its historical apotheosis precisely at the moment of its collapse, preserved as it is through the countless relics scattered around the world. Its destruction marked not just the end of one era, but also the beginning of another one, the alleged post-history in which we still live. Friendship Park was one of the key symbolic sites of Yugoslavia's socialist globalization, a space of geopolitical representation par excellence, where the country's commitment to open borders and cooperation across the ideological divisions was reinforced with every new tree planting ceremony. But Friendship Park was also something more. To put it into Lefebvrean terms, it was a representation of space that projected the vision of the world as it should be, if seen from the subaltern perspective. The core of that vision was the belief that each country should have the freedom to seek its own way to development, in solidarity with others, rather than being subjected to and remade in the image of one or another foreign power. The vehicle of the vision was non-alignment, a political movement through which a diverse group of states, most of them recently decolonized and located in the so-called Third World, sought to avoid the dual traps of ideological rivalry and the ever-evolving strategies of colonialism. The global imaginary of non-alignment, embodied in the Friendship Park, thus sought to dissolve the binary oppositions and hierarchies entrenched in the 4 cardinal directions, not only between the communist East and capitalist West, but also between the developed North and the developing South. Indeed, the global Cold War was not just a binary confrontation between the West and the East. It was also fought in, over, and by the Third World, then struggling for decolonization. The non-aligned movement, as the Croatian historian Tvrtko Jakovina argues, thus emerged as the Cold War's third side, even though it was not organized as a military alliance, but rather as a relatively informal network of political and economic cooperation. Yugoslavia's place in the movement was logical, even if not entirely obvious. With its history of struggle for independence and its reputation for resisting the imperial incursions, staving off Stalin in 1948 was a defining moment in that history. The country was a natural ally of the various anti-colonial movements and the young post-colonial states across the world. But it was also a European country, and it was comparably more developed than many of its peers in Africa and Asia, and thus not really a part of the Third World. As a matter of fact, in the global system of the Cold War, Yugoslavia did not really belong to the remaining two worlds either. It maintained close economic and cultural ties with the First World, but it was certainly not a developed capitalist country. And it was a socialist country, but not a member of the Second World institutions such as the Warsaw Pact and the Comecon. On the symbolic map of the Cold War, Yugoslavia occupied a unique place at the fulcrum of the three-world system, serving as a conduit of modernization between the developed and the developing worlds, as well as a culture mediator between rival ideologies. When talking about the Cold War, we often rely on architectural or urban metaphors, walls, curtains, and blocks, terms that suggest material solidity and visual impenetrability. It is perhaps appropriate, then, that Yugoslavia's alternative global imaginary found its most succinct expression in a park, not an object, but a space, one associated with openness and relaxation. The Iron Curtain, which divided Europe from the Baltic to the Balkans into two opposed blocks, solidified especially firmly around Berlin to form a fortified wall. At its southern end, however, the curtain parted to allow people, goods, ideologies, and culture from either side to spill over into Yugoslavia, where they could be mixed and negotiated. It was there that East and West Europeans could meet temporarily, most regularly at the Adriatic coast, a favorite space of mass leisure. Many such sites across Yugoslavia reveal that the topology of the Cold War was far more complex than we normally assume. Instead of absolute binary division, that topology was more akin to a Mobius strip, its two seemingly opposite sides united by the same underlying dream world. Before Yugoslavia began styling itself as such a site of encounter, however, it went through what can be perhaps best described as a geopolitical slalom, through successive alliances with the two superpowers. In their famous Percentages Agreement of 1944, Stalin and Churchill divided their influence in Yugoslavia 50-50. However, the country emerged out of the war and sided with the USSR 100%, due to the victory of the communist-led liberation movement. For the following several years, Yugoslavia was a Stalinist state ruled by a single party and its leader Josip Broz Tito. The new constitution was modeled after the Soviet constitution of 1936. The economy was highly centralized and run by the state. And in its foreign policy, the country was literally the most faithful ally of the USSR. Behind the scenes, however, there were increasing tensions with Moscow. The Yugoslav leadership was prone to acting independently, which often compromised Stalin's geopolitical strategizing. And in June 1948, the Soviet bloc expelled Yugoslavia from its ranks and cut all economic ties with it. The ensuing crisis provoked epochal internal reforms, as well as a complete international realignment. By 1950, the Stalinist system was out, replaced by the decentralizing project of socialist self-management, which reclaimed the Marxist ideal of withering away of the state. New allies were found in the West. The ideological enmity towards the capitalist world was now a far smaller problem than the immediate military threats coming from the East. The West, particularly the United States, was happy to exploit the first major crack in the communist world, lavishing Yugoslavia with military and economic aid in the hope of its full integration into NATO and the Organization for the European Economic Cooperation. Yugoslavia, however, jealously maintained independence. Several years after Stalin's death, friendly relations were gradually re-established with the Soviets, but never to the point of rejoining the socialist camp. And by the late 1950s, the country positioned itself firmly at an equal distance from both blocs. This period of geopolitical wandering resulted in numerous examples of architecture that defied the usual stylistic expectations of the early Cold War. Yugoslavia's early departure from the Soviet bloc meant that the pressure to impose socialist realism disappeared so early that in practice we find very few realized examples of that doctrine. By the early 1950s, Yugoslav architects were already free to practice modernism, building on their interwar experiences as well as assimilating the latest developments from the West. Here's, for example, the Proletarian Brigade Street in Zagreb, a new showpiece boulevard populated with large modernist slabs directly inspired by Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation. And Gabi, thank you for raising this issue. Just connect the image and the words, right? We're talking about Proletarians Brigade Street and buildings that sort of really defy the image that we would associate with that name. Some of the best among these buildings were completed as early as 1953. The construction of Berlin's Stalinallee had just begun at that time in Berlin, and Le Corbusier's own Unité in Berlin was not to be finished in another 4 years. Le Corbusier was indeed a litmus test of geopolitical reorientation. Before the break with the Soviets, official critics condemned him as an exponent of bourgeois formalism. But just a few months after the break, his Unité d'Habitation in Marseille became the first Western building published in the Yugoslav Architecture Journal after World War II. It was thus highly symbolic that the first international exhibition to arrive in post-war Yugoslavia was Le Corbusier's retrospective, displayed in 5 cities all across the country, in late 1952 and early 1953. The show was organized by the Boston Institute of Contemporary Art, and its only other stop in Europe was West Berlin, thus connecting yet again the 2 most neuralgic spots on the map of Cold War Europe. Throughout the better part of the 1950s, architecture in divided Europe was enlisted in the Cold War through a stylistic rivalry that pitched the international style associated with capitalism, liberal democracy, and the West against socialist realism, which was supposed to represent socialism and the East. In Berlin, as we know, this rivalry played out most famously through the visual opposition established between the 1957 Interbau exposition in Hansaviertel and the Stalinallee. That opposition was precisely the framework through which foreign observers also interpreted Yugoslav architecture as a sign of Tito's break with Russia. Here's Harrison Salisbury, the famous New York Times reporter and Pulitzer Prize winner, writing about Belgrade in 1957. To a visitor from Eastern Europe, this is a quote, "A stroll in Belgrade is like walking out of a grim barracks of ferroconcrete into a light and imaginative world of pastel buildings, flying saucers, and Italianate patios. Nowhere is Yugoslavia's break with the drab monotony and tasteless gingerbread of socialist realism, more dramatic than in the graceful office buildings, apartment houses, and public structures that have replaced the rubble of World War II. Thanks in part to the break with Moscow, and in part to the taste of some skilled architects, no Stalinallees, Gorky streets, or Warsaw skyscrapers mar the Belgrade landscape." By that time, American-style skyscrapers were becoming commonplace around the country, in part thanks to the enthusiastic reception of US culture propaganda. For example, the exhibition Modern Art in the United States, organized by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which arrived in Belgrade in July 1956, showcased the icons of the American international style, such as SOM's Lever House, which you see on the cover of the catalog of the exhibition. For Yugoslav architects, the modernist skyscraper was so clearly associated with the United States that the curtain wall facade, typical of this building type, became known as the American facade. Here's, however, where things become interesting, reminding us that the associations between architectural styles and political ideologies are tenuous at best. Consider, for example, this building, the headquarters of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia in New Belgrade, precisely a skyscraper with an American facade. Notwithstanding the ironic fact that the seat of a communist party directly referenced icons of corporate capitalism, this transfer signaled a reappropriation of the international style by the bureaucracy of a socialist state, precisely at the time when the United States fought to present modernism as apolitical and, as Colin Rowe would put it later, safe for capitalism. The full meaning of this reappropriation was at its most striking at night, when the building's gridded facade, equipped with special lights, spelled out slogans such as "Long live Tito," resembling a gigantic digital billboard. Combining the technological ingenuity of American advertising and the motivations of Soviet-style ideological propaganda, the tower outdid both of its models to produce an uncanny hybrid that explicitly defied the aesthetic divisions of the Cold War. Mass social housing in the immediate vicinity further detached the building's international style aesthetics from the ideological interpretations established in the West. Similar discrepancies haunted Yugoslavia's pavilions at the various international exhibitions at the turn of the 1960s. Some of the most successful ones were designed by Wenceslav Richter, an influential architect from Zagreb, who was explicitly inspired by the socially engaged interwar avant-garde, specifically Russian constructivism and the Bauhaus. His international breakthrough came with the Pavilion of Yugoslavia at Expo 58 in Brussels, the first World's Fair after World War II, for which he designed a daring structure suspended from a single column in the best constructivist tradition. Even though the building eventually had to be built on conventional columns, it retained the basic concept of two interlocking volumes floating above the ground. The visitors quickly interpreted its cascading open space as symbolic of Yugoslavia's open borders. That, however, was the extent to which such politicized interpretations worked. For Richter, his avant-garde aesthetic, based on the synthesis of the arts, was an appropriate expression of Yugoslavia's avant-garde socialism based on self-management. For most visitors and commentators, however, it was merely an index of Yugoslavia's distinction from the Soviet bloc, and self-management remained completely overlooked. In light of these shortcuts between aesthetics and politics, it is interesting to compare the reception of the Pavilion of Yugoslavia to that of West Germany, which deployed similarly minimalist aesthetic of floating horizontal volumes in steel, glass, and wood in order to send a political message. Designed by Egon Eilmann, the German pavilion served to dissociate the country from its Nazi baggage and inscribed it into the new transatlantic alliance based on consumerism and liberal democracy. Despite their vastly differing ideological underpinnings, the Yugoslav and West German pavilions were praised in almost identical terms. Belgian press described Richter's project as a, quote, palace in steel, glass, wood, and marble whose elegance lies in its restraint, whereas Eiermann's was commended for its attitude of restraint and as a wonderwork of elegance and precision. The same words again. They also appear to share the same sources. Richter often acknowledged his own indebtedness to the Bauhaus, whereas Eiermann's pavilion was seen as a proof that the West Germans were the qualified upholders of the Bauhaus tradition instead of the kind of classicism typically associated with the Nazis. This comparison raises big questions about architecture's ability to convey political messages with any degree of precision. The war of styles, which allowed such encoding, however, ultimately fizzled out after the Eastern Bloc abandoned socialist realism, putting an end to the sharp politicization of aesthetics that was characteristic for much of the 1950s. From around 1960 on, architecture became enlisted in the Cold War in an entirely different fashion, not through the way it looks, but through what it does and how it's made. The terrain also shifted from Europe to the wider world, especially to developing countries of Africa and Asia. The turning point occurred, no doubt, when the phenomenal wave of newly decolonized states joined the United Nations around 1960. It was also around that same time that Yugoslavia began fashioning itself into a site of encounter, enlisting architecture in that endeavor in multiple ways. On the one hand, architecture was instrumental in the building of a vast new infrastructure of hospitality. In addition to providing for the burgeoning tourism industry, that infrastructure also included the facilities for numerous international global events, such as the 1979 Mediterranean Games in Split. You see the stadium built for it. I still firmly believe that's the most beautiful stadium I've ever seen, but I'm partial. Or the 1984 Winter Olympic Games in Sarajevo. On the other hand, architecture became a currency of global exchange, as mobile designs began circulating across geopolitical borders with increasing regularity and speed. In that process, Yugoslavia became the recipient of architectural expertise from either side of the Iron Curtain, and at the same time, it started exporting architecture across the world, most notably to the non-aligned countries of Africa and the Middle East. Consider, for example, Skopje. Oops, I have two images here. So this is the exports. I got a bit out of sync with my slides. Consider, for example, Skopje. On July 26, 1963, the capital of Macedonia was destroyed in a massive earthquake that killed over 1,000 inhabitants and left more than 150,000 homeless. Within days, aid started pouring in from all over the world. Prefabricated homes, hospitals, and schools were shipped from countries as distant as Mexico. The US and Soviet soldiers arrived in the city to help clear up the rubble, engaging in a highly symbolic display of a collaboration, their first since the onset of the Cold War. And that's the actual caption from the papers that ran with this image. And you can recognize Soviet and American soldiers, and allegedly this is the first time they meet again after they met at the Elbe at the end of World War II. Even some anti-colonial liberation movements from Africa chipped in as a sign of solidarity. Such efforts were quickly interpreted as potent symbols of Cold War détente, tying in with the enthusiasm generated by the recent signing of the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Similar interpretations carried over to the urban plans for the reconstruction of Skopje, which the United Nations spearheaded as a way of building expertise for all subsequent post-disaster interventions. The planning process was coordinated by Ernest Weissmann, a former apprentice of Le Corbusier and the founding member of the Yugoslav group within SIAM, which is a famous organization of modernist architects. Weissmann, who immigrated to the United States just before the war, was an official of UN Secretariat's Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and it was through him that the UN enlisted numerous international experts in the planning of Skopje. These included the influential office Doxiadis Associates from Greece, known for their involvement in the planning of Islamabad in Pakistan, as well as the Polish planner Adolf Cyborowski, whose international reputation rested on his leading role in the post-war reconstruction of Warsaw. The UN also organized a highly publicized competition for a detailed plan of the city center and invited the proposals from several prominent international offices, including the Dutch architects Jaap Bakema and Jo van der Broek. The winner, however, was Kenzo Tange from Japan, who proposed a system of massive metabolist megastructures evocative of the traditional urban forms of the city wall and city gate, an immensely ambitious project that likely would have surpassed the technical and material abilities of countries way more developed than Yugoslavia. Originally, Tange shared the first prize with the Yugoslav team whose proposal was considered more realistic. But the representational power of his name was such that he ultimately received the commission on his own. Indeed, this was the first major project ever by a Japanese architect outside of Japan, and it testified to how that country reinvented itself after the war into a peaceful and constructive contributor to the international relations. In turn, for the United Nations, the selection of Tange showcased its own role in fostering international cooperation, and then finally for the Yugoslavs, it demonstrated their openness to such international cooperation. The reconstructed Skopje became something akin to an international architectural exhibition, offering a global cross-section of the aesthetics and technologies characteristic of the 1960s, as well as the varying ambitions and strategies of exerting cultural influence. Whole neighborhoods came to be associated with certain countries, for example, large tracts of prefabricated homes that came from Scandinavia. Poland funded the construction of the Museum of Contemporary Art, which was designed by a team of leading Polish architects. Switzerland donated a school designed by another prominent SIAM member, Alfred Roth. Rather than donating individual buildings, the superpowers opted for the contributions with far more reaching effects. The Soviet Union thus constructed a factory of prefabricated concrete panels, whereas the United States awarded a group of young Macedonian architects with scholarships for graduate studies at leading American universities. The successful replication of the American cultural influence was the most explicit in the work of the architect Georgi Konstantinovsky, whose brutalist designs from the late 1960s clearly revealed that he had been a student of Paul Rudolph at Yale. And if you have ever been at Yale and have seen art and architecture building, you can really clearly realize the direct connections. So he studied with Rudolph at Yale, and was then an employee at Time Pay's office in New York. Each of these buildings that I mentioned was a product of individual motivations and relations with the host country. But collectively, they came to represent Yugoslavia's newly found cosmopolitanism and openness to collaboration across the ideological boundaries. Skopje established a precedent for further transsystemic collaborations in the field of planning. For example, it was again the United Nations that coordinated a wide range of international offices and agencies in the regional planning of the Adriatic coast, another quintessential site of Cold War encounter. That encounter was even more multifaceted than the one in Skopje. Socialism promised subsidized leisure time for everyone. But early on, it became clear that tourism could also be a business capable of bringing in much-needed hard currency. By the time the United Nations became involved, in the late 1960s, the Adriatic had already emerged as one of the chief summer destinations in Europe. Participating in the post-war boom of mass tourism east and west, it brought together diverse sets of populations. The locals employed in the tourism industry, the continental Yugoslavs vacationing in workers' resorts or commercial hotels, West Europe's lower middle classes attracted by some of the most affordable prices on the Mediterranean, East European tourists who could more easily obtain permits to travel to a fellow socialist country than to the West, and the occasional international celebrity staying at one of the increasingly common luxury hotels. The architectural infrastructure built for such an encounter was appropriately diverse, ranging from modest camping sites or socialized resorts. And this is my favorite. This is a children's sanatorium not far from Split that really resembles sort of a flying saucer. Stands abandoned nowadays. So it ranged from socialist resorts to commercial hotels. A few images from the 60s. Oops. Covering that kind of mid-range, right, from socialized to mid-range commercial. The regional plans for the coast helped coordinate such complex construction and were explicitly directed towards avoiding overcrowding and overbuilding, the pitfalls of mass tourism found elsewhere on the Mediterranean. These efforts were generally rather successful, as they allowed the coast to retain much of its natural beauty until the late 1990s, when the commercial pressures began undermining the plans and regulations established under socialism. Political representation, however, was never far from tourism. In fact, it may have been instrumental in inaugurating the Adriatic as a desirable destination. And I also already revealed this. The most iconic site associated with non-alignment in Yugoslavia was not really Friendship Park, but an archipelago off the coast of Istria, where President Tito started developing his summer residence as early as 1946. It was at the Brioni Islands that he met the Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, and the Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1956 to discuss the ways in which the developing world could oppose the Cold War, thus paving the way for the founding of the non-aligned movement. It was also there that he received close to 100 heads of state and countless other officials. And we see Castro, we see Eleanor Roosevelt, Indira Gandhi. I always mix up Helmut Schmidt and Willy Brandt. Okay, Willy Brandt, I'm sorry. I know, I understand the difference, but I'm just my age is such that I do remember the faces from the childhood, but not precisely enough. But it was also there that he received the less official guests, including the members of the international jet set, with whom Tito liked to socialize. Most famously, Gina Lollobrigida, Sophia Loren, and Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. Everything about the Brioni defied the stereotype of the allegedly drab socialist environments, offering instead an attractive image of relaxed style and hedonism. The message was no doubt political, distinguishing the country from the rest of the socialist world and thus buttressing its independent foreign policy. But it was also a subliminal advertisement for the tourism industry, making it clear that visiting Yugoslavia was not only politically acceptable, it was also desirable. By the time of the Tito-Nasser-Nehru meeting, another island at the southern end of the Adriatic was also in the process of becoming a luxury resort, with a similar iconic status, but with a more commercial bend. The picturesque fisherman's village on the islet of Sveti Stefan, near the city of Budva in Montenegro. It had been founded in the 15th century, but following the decades of depopulation, by the end of the World War II, it was all but abandoned. In 1955, the state moved a handful of remaining inhabitants to the mainland and started converting the stone village into an upscale hotel while preserving the authenticity of the ambience. Although the works were not completely finished until 1966, the resort opened in 1960 and quickly established itself as a jet-set destination. Taylor and Loren vacationed at Sveti Stefan too, and we see again Sophia Loren, and her favorite villa on the island. But so did other prominent guests, such as Andrea Malraux, Kirk Douglas, Princess Margaret, Ingemar Stenmark, and many other celebrities. The Yugoslav press frequently reported about these visits, thus engraving Sveti Stefan into the Yugoslavs' collective consciousness, both as a site of desire and of a national pride. The construction of tourism infrastructure boomed after the economic reforms of the mid-1960s. Answering the expanded market mechanisms, efforts to raise the comfort level of tourism facilities acquired prominence in the following years as a way to encourage the influx of hard currency. Yugoslavia had a reputation as one of the cheapest countries in Europe to visit, as the New York Times reported in 1960. The available accommodations were accordingly modest. When the esteemed architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable visited Dubrovnik in 1969, she still found the rooms in one of the city's best hotels, the modernist Excelsior, to be at the existence minimum level. Quote, "In the West, we would call it excellent economy accommodations." By the early 1970s, however, luxury resorts and marinas started appearing in greater numbers, ushering in a new hedonistic lifestyle one would not expect to find in a socialist country. Had Huxtable returned to Dubrovnik a few years later, she would have had a chance to enjoy proper American-style luxury, for example, at Libertas Hotel, dug into the sloping terrain to avoid disturbing the natural landscape. And I actually have a video, an advertisement from the early 1970s, and it's absolutely hilarious. I can send you the link if you want. It's on YouTube. Or she could have gone to Babin Cook, also in Dubrovnik, a sprawling complex designed through a collaboration between the Yugoslav office Centar 51 and the office of the well-known American modernist Edward Durrell Stone. In Istria, she could have stayed at Bernardin Hotel in Porto Roche, designed by the Architects Collaborative from Boston, which was famously co-founded by Walter Gropius. Or she could have gone to Haludovo at the island of Krk, another sprawling resort and casino, one of the first on the Adriatic to offer a self-sufficient postmodern environment in which the guests could spend the whole day roaming from one ambiance to another without ever leaving the premises. And again, the lobbies were the ultimate sites of the synthesis of the arts that were lavished with collaborative efforts by architects, interior designers, sculptors, painters, etc. Halfway through the construction, however, Bob Guccione, the founder of the American magazine for men, Penthouse, decided to invest in Haludovo, forming a joint venture with the original owner, the Yugoslav shipping company Brodokomerc. Guccione was a believer in the power of tourism to promote understanding between nations. And he hoped to bring an end to the Cold War by encouraging people to travel. It is probably fair to say that Haludovo played a negligible role in bringing down the Berlin Wall, but it certainly staged some unusual encounters, as the Penthouse's pet girls, and here we see them on the cover of a popular magazine in Yugoslavia, as the Penthouse's pet girls served the well-to-do Americans who gambled side by side with the likes of the non-aligned leader Muammar al-Gaddafi or the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme. But it was not only the wealthy Westerners who developed a fascination with the Adriatic. For many East Europeans, especially the Czechs and Poles, the Adriatic had a mystique that dated back all the way to the Habsburg times. The numbers of East European tourists were much smaller than those coming from the West, but their presence was still steady. They were hardly able to afford to stay in places like Haludovo, so they typically stayed in their own resorts or in auto camps. But it was Eastern Europe that initiated perhaps the most spectacular project ever conceived for the Adriatic. In the mid-1970s, the Czech office Prago Projekt, at the initiative of Professor Karel Žlabek, a civil engineer, I believe, designed a tunnel that would run under the Alps and connect České Budějovice, that's where they make famous beer, right, Budweiser, in Czechoslovakia, and Koper in Yugoslavia, so that the Czechoslovak tourists could arrive at the coast within much shorter time than usual, and, even more importantly, without having to pass through capitalist Austria. The dirt dug out of the tunnel was supposed to be used to build an artificial island so that Czechoslovakia could have its own port in the Adriatic, called appropriately Adriaport. Obviously, this unprecedented feat of engineering never materialized, but Žlabek's project was taken so seriously that trilateral negotiations were actually initiated between Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Yugoslavia, and serious technical drawings produced, as you can see. The 1970s were, no doubt, the period of Yugoslavia's most intense global engagement. During that decade, the country hosted a series of high-profile events which required the construction of vast new architectural infrastructures. These events included, to mention just the most important ones, the Conference for European Security and Cooperation in 1977, for which this was built, again the Mediterranean Games, as I mentioned, and then securing the hosting of the Winter Olympics in 1984. This is my favorite hotel for the Winter Olympics, which, however, burnt in the war in the 1990s. At the same time, the exports of architecture exploded, especially to Africa and the Middle East, through the networks of non-alignment, but also to the aligned world. For example, in the early 1970s, Yugoslav companies were almost simultaneously engaged in the construction of the Olympic Village in Munich and the massive Panorama Hotel in Oberhof in the GDR. It was highly symbolic that this exceptional decade of global exposure culminated with Tito's funeral in Belgrade, allegedly the largest in history up to that moment by the number of state delegations in attendance. But Tito's death also marked the beginning of the end. Yugoslavia survived for another 11 years, maintaining and in some ways even strengthening its position as a site of encounter, but it also had to deal with growing international problems. The rise in nationalist particularism and economic problems undermined two of the three pillars that supported the country. When the Berlin Wall collapsed, the third pillar, non-alignment, lost its apparent purpose as well. As Germany reunited, Yugoslavia disappeared. That urban spaces would be reinscribed with new meanings after Yugoslavia's disappearance was, of course, natural. But it's still surprising how thoroughly and even brutally that has occurred in many instances. In an act of bitter cynicism, Slobodan Milosevic's regime chose Friendship Park as the site for the monument to 1999 NATO bombing of truncated Yugoslavia, of Serbia, sending the message that no friendship is forever. Nevertheless, the park is at least still there, even if it has not welcomed many high-level contributors in almost 25 years. The Olympic facilities in Sarajevo were not as fortunate, as most of them burned down during the Bosnian War in the early 1990s. Other sites suffered in the transition to neoliberal economy. After changing hands several times between increasingly shady owners, Haludovo has lain abandoned for years, its one lavish hallways and pools now covered in shattered glass. But perhaps the most willful negation of one's own cosmopolitan past has occurred in Skopje. Over the past 5 years, the otherwise impoverished government of Macedonia has invested an undisclosed amount, reportedly in the range of tens of millions of dollars, in reinventing the city as a national capital. Every trace of the downtown's international origin disappeared behind an elaborate stage set of quasi-Baroque facades, transforming Skopje into an orgy of historicist kitsch. What was once a display of global solidarity has become a theme park of frustrated nationalism. All these different stories of how Yugoslavia hosted the world during the Cold War reveal an alternate history of globalization, one that defied the common assumptions about the relationship between the West and the East and between the North and the South. They also reveal how the different forms and motivations of hospitality, political representation, commercial tourism, and transfer of expertise all worked in synergy to force the Iron Curtain to part and open a space of encounter in a world defined through division. If some of these stories appear unfamiliar, strange, or perhaps even bizarre, Whence does their strangeness originate? Is it merely a local aberration of the normal order of things, or does it point to the essential strangeness of the Cold War world? Thank you.
So let me just take this new rope again and ask questions and give comments. Tell us perhaps about experience. Did you go to Yugoslavia? Did you know that they had these fabulous buildings? What is it about architecture and politics? Is it possible to semanticize form? Or is it just impossible? Or is it in that very intricate way, Vladimir told us, temporarily, somehow valuable, and then blown away. So, just think a little, and talk to us.
Could I ask, I wanted to ask you if you know anything more about, thank you. I'm Monica Green, one of the other fellows here this year. I wanted to know if you could tell us more about the infrastructure, the intellectual infrastructure of this. Are there architecture schools? If they are, who's coming to them? Is Yugoslavia becoming a center to bring in architecture students from Africa and so forth, who then return to their places? So in what sense is it really globalizing, in that sense of not simply, a few iconic, but actually building the intellectual infrastructure?
Yes, great question. There's so much, right, to this topic that I couldn't even tackle that question, but that is actually what's happening. So there were 3 architecture schools before World War II in Yugoslavia: Belgrade, Zagreb, Ljubljana, and then there were another 3, and the 4th one founded in Pristina in 1980s. But as early as 1952-53, the Yugoslavs actually started traveling around the world and going to Slovenian architects, going to Scandinavia, Croatian architects going to the Netherlands to work with Team 10 architects. Belgrade had close connections with Paris, etc. So that tying in absolutely happens. And then later, the United States as well becomes a very attractive destination for education, as I did partly mention. As part of the non-aligned networks, Yugoslavia is indeed funding the studies of various non-aligned students from various non-aligned countries. And in one of the leading brochures that advertised New Belgrade, right, in the 1960s, we see the vast new student dormitories complex inhabited by women in saris and men with kufis, etc. And there was, I believe, it was more on the representational level, but it definitely did exist. I have not quite been able to track so much about it, but I do plan to do that. So yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation about, how could I say, planet Yugoslavia, which was a world for itself. But we should not forget that it was a kind of a socialist country in a way, more federalized than the more centralized East Germany or Czechoslovakian Republic, but there were some socio-economic guidances. So industrialization, mass production, social housing. And you presented a lot of very beautiful and remarkable examples of haute couture buildings, and how these were very advanced concepts of modern architecture had their effect to that what we could consider prêt-à-porter or mass production. So with the individualization of the mass housing more advanced than in other socialist countries by this inspiration. And just a smaller question about some sources in the pre-war times. Were there some well-known modernists from the 1920s, 30s still working in the 50s in Yugoslavia?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Great questions. First question about housing. Yes, absolutely. I could not tackle even this whole area what socialism meant in Yugoslavia, right? But my good friend and writing partner Mare Kulić and I wrote a book which came out by chance here in Berlin. So we do talk about that in that book. I would say that when it comes to housing. The success of Yugoslav housing was product of its failure, right? The post-war ideal in producing mass housing was standardization and typification, right? And that's precisely what we see in a lot of vast parts of Europe, but especially in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union, well, in Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, not so much in Poland, where several types of apartments and buildings were replicated successfully, industrially produced in tens of thousands and in some instances in millions of copies. Due to the decentralized system in Yugoslavia, that never happened. There was the desire to prefabricate and standardize and typify, etc., whatever the terms would be. But that never happened. Standards, even standards of sizes of rooms were introduced very late. So it was a matter of discoordination, but it prevented kind of the image of uniformity that became that kind of really revived image of socialist housing in the rest of Eastern Europe. So there was I could go on for a long time about that, but I'm going to stop here and we can continue later. Continuities with pre-World War II architecture, absolutely. One of the main reasons why architects in Yugoslavia managed to sort of stave off the push to impose socialist realism in the late 1940s was the fact that the new architecture elite that came to power in social terms because they participated in the war and were either communist or left-leaning, were all pre-war modernists, right? We see that connection between modernism and socialism, communism, coming from before World War II. And I didn't even have a chance to talk about this. It's a really interesting but long story. In the 1940s, we see this crazy debate where there's a push by the politicians to impose socialist realism, whatever that means. And then architects in power, those directors of design institutes, professors at the universities, are sort of trying to subvert the rhetoric and argue explicitly. Yeah, we are building socialist realism, but socialist realism has nothing to do with historical ornament, right? Which is precisely the opposite of everything that you saw in the pictures when you looked at Soviet architecture, right? So it's precisely because they're already indoctrinated well-known modernists as well as leftists or communists who come to social positions after the war that they're able to push it in such a way.
Sounds pretty subversive. It's your turn and yours, and then several more I took you in my notebook. So I'm.
So this was incredible. This was really great. So you laid out a context of this is a case of socialism, but I wonder if you would resist a different kind of reading, which is that the architecture, and especially the kind of cosmopolitan complexity of it, is actually a kind of a national story. in fact, a coherent national story of a Yugoslav identity that rose and fell. And that is kind of beautifully illustrated by all of this architecture, that it's a kind of a national identity based in cosmopolitan kind of complexity. Is that sort of, so it's a different kind of, I don't know if that's an offensive way of putting it or not.
I do believe that you are really right. But the problem, and it absolutely is for me, and probably for much of my generation, the problem is that, in a way, that coalescence of identity based on the architecture that we saw, based on popular music that really became pan-Yugoslav by the late 1970s, 1980s, came in a way too late. The effects of it are actually felt now in retrospect in kind of this way of, well, it's called Yugo-nostalgia. It's sort of the counterpart to nostalgia, right? And there's even a term of Titostalgia that Slovenian anthropologist coined. So I do believe there's this thwarted, undermined identity that was built, but that really is now just bursting occasionally. Well, in projects like mine, I mean, I am a product of that in a way.
Yeah, and this is why there is no one who wants to inherit all this former Yugoslavian modernist architecture, because identity constructions have shifted elsewhere, and style also has. If you look at Skopje, it's yours.
Okay. Wonderful talk. Thank you so much. And so I want to push you to think a little bit about, I want to emplace the buildings and think a little bit more about the space in which the buildings are embedded in terms of what you showed us here. And I couldn't help but think about political ecology and relationship to nature. And so one of the things I think that you did so well is to show us the kinds of commitments, the kinds of archaeological commitments, geopolitical but cosmopolitan commitments to open borders. But I'm also thinking more about the kinds of ecological commitments to greenscapes. And one of the things I think that maybe you could comment on, because especially Friendship Park, right? The emplacement, I mean, this commitment to what several scholars, myself included, thought about as eco-socialism, right? And the relationship and placement with these greenscapes, thinking about, and you've shown us quite clearly, the relationship with rivers and with the ocean, and the creation of parks as spaces of leisure. So can you say a little bit more then maybe about how the ideological messages are embedded in ideas about nature and ecology?
That's really great, and that's the part that I, as an architecture historian, might be theoretically missing. But that's precisely why being here is so great, because I can learn more. But everything that you said very nicely and precisely, I know I can talk about, but I'm lacking the awareness and the language. But absolutely,
but that
right?
was a role
the park, and all of New Belgrade, but park in particular, is at a very symbolic, very important site at the confluence of the Danube, right, which is the largest river in the part of Europe, and the Sava, which is the largest river of Yugoslavia. They joined there. All of New Belgrade, and I have written about this elsewhere, so I didn't even have the time to squeeze this in. All of New Belgrade was no man's land for centuries between Ottoman and Habsburg empires. And for the first time came to be part of the same country in 1918 when the first Yugoslavia was founded, but it wasn't developed. So building the whole city there is really a hugely symbolic act of first unification of South Slavic peoples that were divided by empires for really millennia, not just centuries. So that awareness is absolutely there. And then you add this additional dimension of global connecting, right? That the park kind of brings into that space that really ties all the scales, right? From the soil, right, to the scale of the whole world.
It
On the
undermines the
coast,
stereotype of the country jungle, right? It's
oh,
associated with
absolutely,
social
yeah.
architecture.
But it's also the realized modernist dream of living in a park. Right?
And this is a city landscape in a way, and I think this opens up more debate.
So just to answer the second question, because it's really important, the coast, actually the plans under the United Nations were specifically geared towards preserving the coast so that it's not overbuilt, so that construction, so that all the tourism facilities are concentrated into these new environments tied to existing social structure, and that actually was quite successful for a while.
My question goes in a similar direction. Did architecture in the interwar years in the new Yugoslavia serve as a tool for a new national identity, for example, like similar in Slovakia, as you see it in the city of Brno? And has this tradition then been continued after the war under a kind of like a more national aspect or the more international socialistic aspect?
That's also a great question. So Yugoslavia is founded in 1918 under a Serbian dynasty, and there's a whole world of theory about Yugoslav nationalism, and there are several models that were tested at the time. But basically, the idea was to forge a single unified nation out of these disparate ethnicities, religions that have lived separated under different empires for centuries. That fails miserably, right? Because ultimately the country is dismembered when World War II begins. There are great tensions, especially between Serbs and Croats, because the Serbs are seen as hegemonistic because of basically the bourgeois elite and the royal family in Belgrade sort of keeps that hegemony. And second, Yugoslavia is founded on federalist principles. So there's a very tense relationship between unity and individual national identity. So Yugoslavia consisted of 6 different republics. They were supposed to be nation states. Bosnia was a nation state of 3 ethnicities, right? There were Serbs and Croats, and they were called Muslims at the time, which eventually became today's Bosnia. So it's really complicated. But there's a balance between unity of the country and these individual identities. So the individual capitals of Yugoslavia become sort of quasi-national capitals under the big umbrella of the Yugoslav Federation. And of course, one of the founding mottos of Yugoslavia is brotherhood and unity. That's precisely that. Brotherhood of distinct brothers, right? Distinct nations, but united within the same container of the country.
Okay,
Vladimir, thank you for your wonderful talk. My question is a bit more historiographical, right? Why are we in 2015 speaking about that? And I know we come from the same block, and although I was very jealous of your block, coming from East Germany, we can only identify with, you did it in a very charming way, and also maybe this largely American crowd to get actually back into that embrace with Tito, right? Into those sites of leisure. So that was rather wonderful, but maybe like from my perspective, I would like to ask you maybe about that driving force in our academic work, which is, it's rather fascinating and strange in the way how we grew up, right? In a kind of a sense of being against anything in that regime. Now you're probably personally leaving that country, and in a way now after a while looking back at it, this should turn into a question that I don't want to hit, but I think you describe in that kind of Cold War divide, of curtains. That's all of a sudden it's not so easy, to see it in binary conflicts.
Yeah.
Rather, it's complex, and it's this kind of non-aligned movements and that makes your work so fascinating and so important, because it's not the Cold War divide, right? It's not East and West. It's
something
third world country, and so I think it's important also to locate why you write it, and that there's actually something behind it. Actually, this your reading of globalization through something that originates maybe in a not in nationalism, but in a kind of a socialist.
Yes, you're touching really kind of important, very sensitive spot. Yes, how can it be a nationalism when the country doesn't exist, right? When the nation doesn't exist. But yes, it's a story of an alternative globalization. I think that I'm trying to sort of theorize that, and we're still really not very far advanced. But we might talk about the sort of lateral globalization that sort of try to dissolve the hierarchies and to see the space, perceive the space, and occupy global space in a different way, which I think is really interesting as a history, but also as a way to legitimate the very possibility of something like that nowadays. I'll tie myself in the knot to answer your question. Maybe I should get back to you in 3 days. But it's a tough question, and it's very personal in a way, but also personal and political, and cuts every imaginable way.
Okay, so you may have wonderful conversations
Yes.
on Facebook.
Yes.
We have another question, and this is the last call, because we have to call it really one. This is another. Okay, no, I'm going to keep track. Of course, it's
Okay, I have a comment
and you and you. Okay, cool. And it was just a gesture, or did you want to speak?
Well, that's enough. If you still want questions after 4, I can answer.
Okay. So, but I think, it's such a lively debate. I do not want to cut it now, but we have to keep in mind that somehow also Vladimir will get tired one moment. So it's your thinking.
Okay, I have a comment and a question. The comment is actually the idea that it was a way to build a national identity. I think it was actually opposed. I think because of the thing of what was the national identity in Yugoslavia. Okay, I am Croatian, so I grew up in the same country, and I think because we all had to write in our documents, of course we were the citizens of Yugoslavia, but the nationality was something else which we had to write, and the Yugoslav nationality was first accepted in the 80s, I think.
Yes.
It was quite late, yeah.
70s.
So okay, but it was not something that was actually normal and accepted as a normal thing, and it was still quite a minor group of people who defined themselves like this. So I think this is actually more that this modernist architecture was suspending the national identity, and this is why this frenzied, you picked a very nice picture from Macedonia, but you can find examples all over the former Yugoslav countries where the sketch goes into crazy.
Although not on this scale.
But but my actual question was, I have the feeling that we were always looking towards the West. Were there any examples of any influences from the Eastern Bloc, or actually people building in the East, or not in the non-aligned countries, which was actually a lot, but in the Eastern Bloc countries?
There were. I tried to show the Oberhof Hotel. There were actually, really, one of the interesting phenomena that I'm also trying to write about is how hospitality becomes the particular expertise that's exported, and becomes this really kind of political metaphor, and it's really interesting. But hotels are exported to East Germany, to Czechoslovakia, to other countries. However, the scale of exports to Eastern Bloc is nowhere comparable to the scale of exports to Africa and the Middle East. Iraq, for example, in the 1970s is, well, another really interesting site of encounter that we do not think of. Right? Iraq,
Like Vietnam.
yes. Iraq nationalizes the oil fields in the late 60s, and then finally brings in the revenues from oil, and then going around the world shopping for architects. Baghdad is 1970s, is the most globalized city in terms of architecture in the world, which we absolutely do not have an idea of. So yes, there were exports to the Eastern Bloc, but nowhere, the scale was nowhere comparable to the exports to non-aligned countries.
With no influence the other way around.
The influences are really cut short. It's really interesting when you look at the architectural periodicals. 45 through 48, architectural periodicals in Yugoslavia are only talking about Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Absolutely nothing from the West, and if there is something, it's critical. Within a few months, there's a rather radical transformation. And despite the openness, the balance in architecture is never reestablished. So that's also a really sensitive thing to be able to talk about. How do we talk about, on the one hand, political balance, which does not quite translate in cultural and architectural terms, and the influence from Eastern Europe is greatly, it never really reaches anywhere close to the influences coming from the West. Yes.
Thank you for an excellent talk. You described really well the process, how political geography is actually created through this inscription of ideological debates. And at the end, you seem to suggest that the relative brevity of the Cold War creates a concentrated time frame that perhaps makes this happen more intensely, or at least makes it more visible. And I don't know if that was what you really wanted to say, but I also wondered if you thought about the concentratedness of the actual geography as intensifying something. And this is, I guess, my other question, whether or not this might be a hyperbolic example of something that occurs much more broadly and at a slower pace and in a less visible form.
Yes, of course. Your observation is spot on. I never articulated in such a way, but now I'm going to steal it from you. But yes, I think that we really may be able to talk about the Cold War, and especially perhaps that moment around 1960, which is a turning point really in history, when so many countries become decolonized. We can't really talk about it as a concentrated, compressed moment of happening on a global scale. And it's precisely within a few years, really, that at least in architectural terms, we have this complete shifting of the grounds in which ideological war is fought, right? From representational terms, from styles, right? What building looks like is the defining characteristic of ideology, shifting to something completely different, right? In a way, back to what the ideological debates originally were about. How do we make the buildings and what the buildings serve, right? And that becomes the key question of what's socialist, right? It's not about whether we have the statue of Lenin on top. It precisely happens around this, within a few years, maybe half a decade, in the late 50s and early 60s. So compression, right, both spatial and kind of time compression is perhaps really a good way to think about these problems.
Two questions, and I missed somebody. I do think just keep it short, because I do think it gets somehow. Yes.
One question regarding that early show by Le Corbusier, which then traveled from Yugoslavia to Berlin, organized by the MoMA. Do you know whether the show has been financed by the CIA, like similar shows organized by the MoMA, which toured Europe in the early 1950s?
Yes. I don't know about the Le Corbusier show, the Globalization was actually organized by the Boston Institute of Contemporary Arts, and it was shown in the States and was originally planned to go, and it did go to South America. And then it was planned for the show to tour West Europe. So it came to West Berlin, and it was supposed to go to Munich, I believe, and maybe Milan, and a few other places in West Europe. But then urgently, and they still need to go to Boston to the Institute of Contemporary Arts to discover really the story behind it. It was urgently sidetracked from West Berlin to Belgrade, and it never went to these other places in Western Europe. And of course, it's 1952-53. I mean, it's a very politically charged moment. So it's entirely logical to think in those terms. This sort of shifting of the route did happen for very obvious political reasons, but that's still something I need to pinpoint. And I do not know whether CIA funded it.
So, would you be very frustrated if we just talked to you? I would love to make one remark myself. It will be very short. Looking at Yugoslavian architecture has been so thrilling for me because in one of the conferences, also with Vladimir, we saw a couple or more than a couple of young people dealing with post-war modernist heritage in their newly founded ex-Yugoslavian new nation countries, where it was severely refuted. And so the point was that the former Yugoslavia was not yet nostalgia, but it was just the ballads and the words of everything, and the architecture went with it. So like the Russian constructivism of the 60s goes away with Kulić, and is replaced by things like we saw in Skopje on that bridge. So the point is, whose heritage is this corpus of buildings? And who claims it? Who wants it? Who does not want it? And this is where I want to put one of those young women coming from Slovenia, and she said, well, the most useful international charter we can apply to this situation is the Prague Convention on the Social Value of Cultural Heritage by the Council of Europe in 2005, that introduces, instead of talking about nations or identity groups, open heritage companies. I mean, they call it heritage community. And the heritage community is open, in-twin, and space for those who want to step in. And the only tie that binds them together is that they together like or want to preserve a certain building. And this offers a model of an attachment to heritage that goes beyond national constructions. And this seemed to be the obvious way to think about all these buildings and all these places you talked about in terms of heritage, because there is no nation. And then, of course, with all these attempts to build new nations and to invent something like a Croat Romanesque, a very honest art historian invented that, and I do think it's, of course, like all these national things, an invention. So that there is a very intricate debate to hold about the heritage status of all these things you showed us. And now I want to thank you all for listening so attentively, for all those wonderful questions.
Thank you.